Welcome everyone to Wednesday Night at the Lab. I'm Tom Zinnan. I work here at the UW-Madison Biotechnology Center. I also work for the Division of Extension here, and on behalf of those folks and our other co-organizers, Wisconsin Public Television, the Wisconsin Alumni Association, and the UW-Madison Science Alliance, thanks again for coming to Wednesday Night at the Lab. We do this every Wednesday night, 50 times a year. Tonight, it's my great pleasure to introduce to you Matthew McCarty. He's a Professor of Roman Archaeology at the University of British Columbia, which is in Vancouver, one of the prettiest places on the planet. He was born in Troy, New York, which has not recently been described as one of the prettiest places on the planet. He went to high school at Choate in Connecticut, and then he went to Yale University, where he studied art history and classics. That means that he reads and speaks French and Italian. He reads Latin, German, Greek, and Turkish, and he can read and speak Romanian. I'm envious. Then he went to Oxford University in England and got his master's and PhD there in archaeology. Then he returned to Yale for 2 years, then went to Princeton for 3 years, and has been at the University of British Columbia for the last 4 years. Delighted that he's here in Madison. Another person who's really delighted but really disappointed is my 14-year-old daughter, who, when I told her tonight's talk was on Roman archaeology, she went, because she wanted to be here, but she had swim team. So that's high praise. Tonight he's going to be talking to us about Between Trench and Lab, Reconstructing the Roman Mystery Religion of Mithras. So would you please join me in welcoming Matthew McCarty to Wednesday Night at the Lab.
Thank you for that kind introduction, and thank you to all of you for coming out tonight to hear this. It's a real honor to be here at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, not only because it's a great institution, but because my wife is a proud graduate of this institution. And on a night we're talking about religion, I should probably confess that she very quickly converted me to be a Badger fan.
What's the baptism?
Name all the basketball players. So, what I want to do tonight is to pose a simple question. How do we recreate, reconstruct an ancient religion for which we have few sources? How do we build it literally from the ground up? And I'm going to do that by introducing you to archaeological science, archaeology as practiced in the field, and my own excavation of a temple to the Persian god Mithras in the middle of modern Transylvania. 1900 years ago, the Roman Empire was at its height. At this time, a new religion was spreading like wildfire through that empire. It focused around a traditional god from the Middle East. It attracted worshippers from all across Roman society, but especially from its lower end, slaves, former slaves, maybe the urban middle class. And it forever transformed society and religion in the Roman world. Now, if this story sounds familiar to you, it's because it's also the story of early Christianity. But that's not what we're here to talk about tonight. We're here to talk about something that's far less well-known, far less talked about, and far less attested: the cult of the Persian god Mithras. In fact, in the 19th century, the French scholar Ernest Renan could quip, if the world hadn't become Christian, it would have become Mithraist. And yet this is a cult shrouded in darkness, one that we have to look in the ground to understand more fully. And if you take anything from tonight's talk, let it be these two things. First, that archaeology can do this for us. It can tell us what religion was really all about to ancient worshippers. And second, I want you to take away that the cult of Mithras, religion in general, is less in the ancient world about some fixed, bounded doctrine. It's not something. But rather, we need to think about it in terms of individual worshippers, people, and the practices they performed, and the ways that those could interact, intersect, relate, and create new and hybrid forms of worship. But before we get there, I want to say a few words about what we know about the cult of Mithras and how we know it. We can't talk about the worship of Mithras without talking about this fellow on the left with his handlebar mustache. That's the Belgian scholar Frans Cumont. Cumont was the first to look at this cult in detail, to build a picture of it. It's to him that we owe the comparison with Christianity. For Cumont, the cult of Mithras was very much like the cult of Christianity. The cult of Mithras, in fact, paved the way in the Roman Empire for the success of Christianity. For him, what Mithraism was a doctrine, a system of beliefs that focused around a saving god, Mithras. The way he got there was to start with the bits of text that survive to us. Now, when I say bits of text, I really do mean bits. We don't have a single text written by worshippers of Mithras that survives in literary form. All we have are brief little one-liners, mostly in Christian authors who were a bit hostile to the worship of Mithras. I give you one example on the screen there to give you a sense of the flavor of these. It's Justin Martyr, who's one of the theologians who works out Orthodox Catholic Eucharistic theology. He says, Jesus took bread, gave thanks, do this in remembrance of me, took the cup, and then he throws in a little line, those wicked Mithraic devils imitate this. That is, what they do is derivative. It's knockoff religion. It's clearly quite hostile. So the sorts of sources that we have at our disposal aren't nice, clear, transparent windows into the past. These texts are sometimes possibly willfully misrepresenting the cult of Mithras. Not the sort of thing that I would want to use as primary evidence. That said, we do glean something from this. Justin and all ancient authors who mention Mithras don't talk about Mithraism. That's something that comes in the 19th century as a term. They talk about, in Greek, ta mysteria Mithru, the mysteries of Mithras. Well, what does this mean? Think away the word mystery as you know it. This is not what mysteria in Greek means. In Greek, mysteria means not something hidden, not something, a type of knowledge. It means something that changes your status. It makes you blessed, for example. It makes you extra lucky. It gives you some kind of different status. The mysteries are something that is done. They are an act. And this is our first clue that what we should be looking at in trying to understand religion in the Roman Empire or the religion of Mithras is not belief in doctrine, it's things done. It's acts, including acts of initiation. Now, the other thing, these texts in hand, that Cumont did was draw together a range of monumental material sources from across the Roman Empire. Most of these were images like this. And images like that exist from Syria to the edge of Britain, in different media, in different styles, all made by local artists. They all show a similar scene at the middle. Here, you see the god Mithras. He is youthful, with curly hair. With his left knee, he drives a bull into the ground. There's the bull's bent knee. With his left hand, he grabs the snout of that bull, yanks it up, so that he can plunge a dagger into the shoulder or neck of that bull. The scene is often surrounded by a veritable zoo of animals: a dog, a snake, a scorpion, a raven, and sometimes other figures. In this case, a personification of the sun, a personification of the moon, and 2 torchbearers, one on either side. There are variations. This is not a canonical image. It's a loosely adapted image across the empire. The other thing that we have are the monumental buildings in which these images were displayed. We've got about 40 of them from across the empire. They tend to be laid out in similar ways. They have long benches on either side flanking a central nave, and the image of the god at the far end, stabbing that bull. Now, we call these sanctuaries today Mithraea, singular Mithraeum. In the ancient world, for an ancient worshiper, the term most commonly used to describe them was cave. These are caves that you go to. And oftentimes, the buildings themselves were set slightly underground to give you this cave-like environment. So, this is what we have: images and buildings, monuments. So what do we do with them? Well, in the late 19th century and through to today, if you want to make a religion, if you want to reconstruct a religion, you want to reconstruct beliefs and doctrine and dogma. And that is precisely what people have done. They have, for example, taken this image and asked, what does it mean? What does it symbolize to a worshiper? And they've said, well, all of these animals, they might be different constellations. This whole religion could be about astronomy or astrology, about telling initiates secret truths about the way the cosmos worked, giving them insider knowledge into how the universe moved and shaped human being and human fate. Well, I want to stop right there. I want to push the pause button, and I want to say, that's all fine and good. But in the ancient Roman world, when we say religion, what we're mostly talking about is not things, not matters of belief, not matters of orthodoxy and thinking specific things, but matters of doing, matters of orthopraxy, doing things right to have the gods be on your side. And in the case of the cult of Mithras, before we talk about belief, doctrine, those high up things, maybe we ought to start by asking more basic questions, questions that have largely been ignored. What do you do in these sanctuaries? How often do you do it? Who does it? And how do those practices relate to one another in time and in space across the Roman Empire? So let's ask different questions. And it just so happens that these are the sorts of questions that we can answer with careful, contextual, archaeological inquiry. So, let's try to answer them. I want to take you to the edges of the Roman Empire, to a site that I excavated between 2013 and 2017. So here's Rome. We're going all the way up to the Roman province of Dacia on the far side of the Danube. Dacia corresponds roughly to the modern region of Transylvania in Romania. Now, Dacia is an interesting province in its own right. It was the last province to be conquered by the Roman Empire, the last province in. It only became a province in 106 CE. and it was the first province to be abandoned by the Romans around 250 CE. So it's only a Roman province for a very short period. But while it's a Roman province, a few new cities are built. And one of these is one of the two provincial capitals at Apulum. Today, Apulum is a modern county capital called Alba Iulia, a quaint Central European city that's dominated by this star-shaped 18th century Austrian fort that was built when Transylvania was right on the border between the Austrian Empire and the Ottoman Empire in the Balkans. Over the last 2 decades, that fort has been restored literally brick by brick, complete with gaudy Viennese Baroque sculpture all over the gates. And over the summer, it becomes a tourist hub in this part of Europe. Every day at noon, there's a group of reenactors dressed as Austrian soldiers who does a changing of the guard. Every Friday night over the summer, there's a Roman versus Dacian battle reenactment. And the fort itself is filled with stands, carts selling tourist tchotchkes, fresh squeezed lemonade, and of course, the beer tents, necessary in this part of Europe. That star-shaped fort sits directly over a Roman castrum, a Roman legionary fort. This was the main legionary headquarters in the province of Dacia. This is where the army was based. And on the outskirts of that fort, a town developed. And it's in that town, just outside the fort, that the temple to Mithras sits. Basically, in the backyard of a 1960s communist-era house. In 2008, while the fort was being rebuilt brick by brick, a local developer thought, just outside the fort is a great place for a boutique hotel. So he planned to convert this property into a hotel. There are laws in Romania and there are laws in Wisconsin that wherever you're close to a historically protected site, before you can do any building, you've got to bring in archaeologists to make sure that before you build, there's nothing of huge significance, historical significance on the site. And so in 2008, a team from the local museum came onto this property. And what they did was just sink a series of holes to see what was there. So they dug a first hole, and they found what they thought was a little medieval well. Not too exciting. They dug a second pit, they found nothing. They dug a third pit, and they found nothing. It's one of the truisms of archaeology that you always find the most exciting stuff at the end. It's like the last day of excavation, you find the thing that's a game changer, that's really exciting, that keeps you wanting to come back to the site. It was no different here. Because in trench number 4, they found the remains of a Roman building. And in that building, they found a large inscribed altar dedicated to Mithras. That was the slam dunk clue that this building was a sanctuary to Mithras. Now, the developer, realizing that this was going to be very expensive to excavate and conserve, quickly changed his mind, and the whole site was reburied, with about a third of the building excavated. And that's where my project came in. A few years later, wanting to answer those questions about the cult of Mithras, I developed a joint excavation with a local Romanian colleague that would look at this site and offer the first scientific excavations of a temple in all of this part of Romania. And over the course of 4 years, 1 month each year, we kept coming back to this site with groups of students from our various institutions that we trained in archaeological field techniques. Now, what do I mean by scientific archaeology? Now, that rescue excavation in 2008 and the excavation of almost every other Mithraism that is known was focused on understanding what was there. The monuments, the walls, the altars, the images. Scientific archaeology and modern best practice, still not widely used in Central and Eastern Europe, instead asks not what's there, but how did what's there get to be there? What are the processes, both natural and human, that got things to be how they are? And how do we reconstruct those processes? Natural processes can be things like decay, collapse, weathering, rusting. Man-made processes are things like building, destroying, dropping, intentionally discarding. And the way we do that is by observing changes in soil that represent the way different patches of a site get created. So here I think you can see, there it's a little bit clearer, that on the inside of that yellow line, the soil's a little bit lighter, a little bit more yellow, and it's a little bit darker brown on the outside. Two different processes created this. So what we do is document these differences and excavate each different area independently and record it independently so that we can understand the full set of processes. In this case, that discolored patch was created because someone dug a little pit to mix mud daub, to mix mud for building with. And we could tell that because we took a sample of that soil, took it to the lab, looked at it under the microscope, and saw that it was not just mud, but mud with animal dung, straw, and other things mixed in. Now this means painstakingly removing each of these archaeological features, each of which represents a human event or a natural process, and documenting them in drawings, in photographs, and more, using three-dimensional imaging technologies. So for the site, we now have 3D models of everything that was there, every feature on the site that we can use, look at, manipulate, take measurements from. So even though by excavating we remove material, we're able to always reconstruct the site as it was before we began. And of course, the other thing we do is focus not just on the monumental, but also on the small, the fragmentary. Things like artifacts, man-made objects, the smallest piece of ceramic, the smallest piece of iron, and ecofacts, things like bone, charcoal, and burned seeds. Now, this is a slow process. And to give you some sense of that, the area in green was what that team from the local museum dug in 1 week. The yellow is the area we dug in 3 months. So, it does take much longer, but it gives us much richer knowledge about the past. The other thing to take from this is that that whole green area, most of the building, was totally cleared out. When I took over the site, I was given a milk crate of a few bits of pottery, a couple pieces of bone, and some other random things that they had found. No sense of where they came from, how they were found, anything that would allow me to reconstruct how those came to be in the archaeological record. So in many ways, this third of the building is an archaeological write-off. The other thing that the museum excavators said was that this was a well-preserved Roman site. there were no human interventions after the Roman period that affected the building. Well, within a few weeks, it became clear that that wasn't the case. You'll see how the walls of the building stop right there. They are cut when in the 11th century, someone decided to build a giant house in one corner of the Mithraeum. And down at that corner, at some point after the Roman period, a transverse slump opened up. That's basically a sinkhole. The whole bit of the building just sank and slid down about 1.5 meters, creating a giant hole in the landscape of Alba Iulia that for 6 centuries was used as the city garbage dump. Now, that 11th century house is really important for the archaeology of medieval Romania. It's the first house that we have. It is well preserved. We even had a woven reed mat that survived, one of the first textiles to survive from this period in Romania, that survived when the building burned down. But we're not talking about the medieval period here tonight, so we'll save that for another day. Instead, what I want you to look at is this hearth, this oven in the medieval house. And I want you to notice the way that that oven reuses bits of Roman stone. So that down at the bottom, that's a column. I think you can see the curve, a little bit of molding there. Up here, there's a squared block that's been reused. And right here, that curved piece is probably the top of a well. It's probably a wellhead. And so it's clear that what happened in the 11th century is that the builders of this house went into the ruin of the Mithraeum and quarried it for building material, futzing up all of the archaeology. You'll also remember that I showed you that giant altar. When the excavators found it, it was found with this inscribed side down and this side up. And you'll notice on the back of it the way that it's been hacked. Clearly the altar was simply too heavy to move on its own. It weighs over 700 pounds. So instead of lugging the whole thing around, they just hacked off bits that they could reuse. So this is not a pristine Roman site. There is all of this later intervention that has affected the archaeological record. But we can still say something about the building, and we can still say something about the rites that took place within it. So for the building itself, I've got the plan up top, and down here a drone photo of it that I think is the best place to sort of see and understand how the building works. I should also say that we were able to date the building because it's built over an earlier trash pit. And because it's built over that trash pit and it closes that trash pit, the latest thing in the trash pit has to be earlier than the building of the Mithraeum. In Roman archaeology, we date things primarily by ceramics. We have a very tight chronology for ceramics. And in this case, in that pit, we have fragments of a bowl that was made in central France. We have a couple of thin-walled drinking vessels that come from modern Slovenia. And these we can all date to about 150 to 160 CE. So this means the Mithraeum is built probably shortly after 160, maybe 170, 175-ish. This is neat because it's one of the earliest Mithraea. It's the earliest datable one in the province of Dacia. Now for the building itself, just to orient you and walk you through. Up here, you'll notice that the foundations, and we are looking at foundations, right? When we think about ancient architecture, the first thing many of us picture are things like Greek temples that are standing and built in stone. Or Roman architecture, we think of like the Colosseum, built in stone and concrete. Most ancient buildings, most buildings in the Roman Empire, are not built of stone. They are not built of concrete. They are built of dirt and maybe wood. 99% of every building built in the Roman Empire is dirt. And it's no different here. The foundations are built of rubble, and the walls would have been wood and some configuration of mud. That all doesn't survive, it's collapsed. And this is why if you go to many archaeological sites, you'll walk around and the walls will be about knee height, right? That's what there was in permanent material. So, up here, that foundation dips down a little bit, probably because there was a door sill there that has been robbed out in the medieval period, which suggests that this is the entrance. You come in on this side, and you enter into a kind of antechamber, a foyer, that has a little room to one side that's set on a much lighter foundation, sort of flimsier foundation, probably a sort of storage closet. From there, you pass in to the main nave of the building, which is flanked, as is the case with most temples to Mithras, by those two benches. Now, the neat thing about our Mithraeum is that, if you look, this is the inner wall of that nave. You see that it's built of very large stones that are mortared together. Those were visible in antiquity. They're built of a different material than the much smaller stones that make up the outer wall. Why is that? That's to give you the experience of being in a rocky cave. That's the special effect of the architecture here. From that nave, there's a mortar step that brings you up, there's the step, that brings you up into a rear niche. And that niche would have been where that image to Mithras was displayed. It doesn't survive, but we can say that it wouldn't have been very big. There's no separate foundation for it. So it was of moderate size. All of that means that based on similar buildings and what we know about building techniques in this part of the Roman Empire, we can reconstruct the elevation of the Mithraeum to look something like that, with the big central altar here in the middle. We also had a pair of smaller statue bases that were smashed up and found in the debris covering the site. Those we've reconstructed here and here. These series of inscriptions were all dedicated by the same person. And that tells us something about the social context of this Mithraeum. They were all paid for by a man named Vitalis. Now, from his name, we can say something about Vitalis. He has a single name. He's not Publius Aelius Vitalis, Roman citizen. He's just Vitalis. In Roman terms, that means he's probably a slave. Think away what you know about slavery in the US. Slaves in Roman society could acquire wealth, could pay for, be able to afford, dedications like this. And in this case, Vitalis is probably the person who paid for the entire sanctuary because he dedicates all of the furniture. Vitalis also tells us that he is a treasurer. A treasurer for what? In this case, he's almost certainly a treasurer for the imperial customs system. There's a customs zone that runs around this part of Europe. And they have very wealthy treasurers, people who are who could acquire the means to dedicate a sanctuary like this. So we can say something about where Vitalis worked. He worked for the customs system. Now, the main altar is dedicated to Mithras. One of those statues is dedicated to Cautopates, who's one of those torchbearers, standard stuff. But then Vitalis makes a weird dedication to Transitus Dei, to the transit of the god. That's unusual. In fact, there are only 5 other examples of dedications to the transit of the god. One of them is a statue that shows Mithras carrying a bull over his shoulder. So maybe it's like the transit, like Mithras going somewhere with a dead bull on his shoulder. Still, that behavior, that dedication to transitus, only happens at other sites where the Mithraea are being used by customs personnel. What this tells us is that Vitalis has learned about and learned how to worship Mithras at work through his social network of fellow customs workers. So, what we've been able to do is tell what the building was like, and we've been able to tell that the person who paid for it learned about Mithras and learned how to worship Mithras in the context of the imperial customs system. That's kind of cool from a micro-historical perspective. But we can go even further. Now, I said what the medievals didn't muck up, the 2008 excavators did muck up. There was one deposit that was left untouched in both periods. It sits in the middle of the nave in a box that was set below the level of the floor of the building. So this was put in place before the floor was laid. And this box was constructed out of a series of ceramic tiles. And it was clearly meant to delineate something important inside it. Excavating the contents of that box revealed that it contained a variety of burned ash, charcoal, and some bone. Now, one of the things we try to do to capture all of the eco-facts possible, especially from clearly important deposits like this, is to do soil flotation. We take the buckets of excavated soil, after they've been documented, and put them in essentially a water tank. Things that are nice and light, like charcoal or charred seeds, will float to the top, where they can be skimmed off and studied. Things that are a little bit heavier can be run through several series of mesh screens to capture things of different size, and then hand sorted to pull out bone and chuck away rock and things. And this lets us reconstruct what went into that box. Animal bone represented most of the contents of the box. These bones were primarily from chicken and piglet. And what I want you to see here is the fact that you're looking at mostly legs and wings of chickens. You're looking at the meaty bits. Breasts in ancient chickens, not that meaty. That's a modern thing. Chickens are basically pigeons in the ancient world. All of the meat's on the legs. So we have meaty bits. We also have some piglets that are preserved from trotter to tail, so whole pigs, bones from entire pigs that come out of there. Because these are meaty bits, and because they're nice animal bits, it suggests that we're looking at food. We're looking at the remains of a feast. The other thing that I want you to note is that some of these bones look different than others. So here we have a couple of chicken legs, and you'll note that some of them show signs of being burned. Right? They've been set on a flame on their own. Now this is interesting because it tells us that some of this food wasn't consumed. It was instead burned. And in the Greco-Roman world, there's a logic of offering burned food to the gods for them to eat. So what we're seeing is a banquet in which the god took part, eating the same cuts as his worshippers. We also have a variety of charred seeds from that deposit. We have some grape seeds that might have been burned either as whole grapes, as a food offering. We have bits of weeds. We have cleavers and bindweed. which are most of the seeds in this deposit, those sorts of weeds produce very pretty flowers. And it looks as though these are flowers that have been collected and burned also as an offering. And then we have other kinds of fruit and wild vegetable, things like a blackthorn and probably a radish. So again, what we're getting a picture of is something that's partially offered, foods that are offered and flowers that are offered to the god, as well as food that's consumed by people. So, if we want to reconstruct the whole process that got things there, we had a selection of meaty bits from butchered animals. None of the unedible bits show up. Some of these foods are burned for the god. Some are eaten by worshippers. Some of that material is collected, and it's buried under the floor before the building is completed. This is, in other words, a foundation deposit, and it's meant to commemorate an event, a meal between worshippers and God. And it's not a small meal either. The amount of meat produced just from the bones in that box would have been between 30 and 120 kilos of meat. So this is a pretty big feast that's being consumed. We can tell more, though. This suggests to us that before the Mithraism is done, before any of that symbolic stuff happens, what matters to the worshippers is that communal dining aspect of the cult. This is what they're commemorating. They're not commemorating the stars. They're not commemorating astrological symbolism. What matters to them is being together as a group. Now, we can also figure out when they were doing this. Because we know when all of these various plants were in season, when they were available to be burned in this part of Romania. They tend to cluster at the end of summer. We can also, from the bones, tell how old the pigs were when they were slaughtered. And we know that pigs in the Roman world were farrowed twice a year. And that farrowing actually lines up well with the seasonality of the fruits and plants, which tells us that this foundation, this Mithraism, was founded in late summer, early autumn, between August and September. So that is a high degree of precision. Also on the astronomical front, it is not at any of the big cosmological events that happen throughout the year. It's not at the equinox, it's not at the solstice. It's actually smack between them. So again, this suggests to us that the cult isn't about astrology. It's about communal dining. We can go a step further, too. Because our deposit under the floor is just one of several foundation deposits at Mithraea across the empire. These have never been recognized as belonging to a group together. None of them have been studied in as much detail as ours, but they exist at a number of Mithraea. So, for example, all the way in Syria, at Dura Europos, a tile box sat under the brick floor of the Mithraeum, built in 169 CE. At Tienen, a tile box that looks identical to ours was excavated a few years ago. At Bornheim, apologies for the images, at Bornheim, when the Mithraeum was first built in about 150 CE, a tile box contained remains of burned and unburned foods. When that Mithraeum was rebuilt 150 years later, a new box was set up right next to that first box, containing similar things. So this is a long rite. It doesn't happen at every Mithraeum. Right? There are only a few, but they're spread across the whole of the empire. All of these Mithraea, in other words, were founded with common rites. Now this is important because it is our first evidence for shared ritual practices at these Mithras temples across the empire. But again, not all of them. But that leads us to a question. How do you know how to properly inaugurate, how to properly found a Mithraeum? How do you know how to perform the ritual to start these off? Well, there are a couple of options. The most basic way you learn how to do religion in the ancient world is by watching. Right? You observe what others do, you learn how to do it yourself, and then you perform it. There's no formal ritual education in most ancient religion. The problem with the foundation rite is you only watch it once. You only see it once in your lifetime. Even at a site like Bornheim, where there are 2 boxes, there are 150 years between them. No one in the Roman world was living that long. So, it's not by watching. Well, option 2 is that you write it down. You have some kind of prescriptive Book of Common Prayer that might be used. There's almost no evidence for these in the ancient world, full stop. And in the case of Mithraism, there's enough variation among these deposits. They're all set roughly in the same part of the Mithraeum, but they include different kinds of foodstuffs, sometimes different containers, pots instead of boxes. There's variation, which suggests that there's not a sort of prescriptive text that tells you what to do. So what's left? Well, maybe people are just doing rites they do in other places. People do have foundation rites in the Roman Empire for different kinds of buildings and temples. None of them, though, look like this. None of them share this level of similarity. So that really leaves us with a last option, which is that there are trained ritual experts in the cult. People who know this is how you found a Mithraeum. We might call them priests. We might call them just ritual experts. But it seems that they are present. This is a group that we wouldn't know about if we didn't have archaeology. They're not mentioned in texts. They're not mentioned in inscriptions, which only record people who pay for stuff, not people who have the technical know-how to make it happen. So archaeology is telling us a lot more about the dynamics of this cult, and that it perhaps spreads along the lines of the movement of such experts. But our site tells us one more thing still about that ritual expert. It's not Vitalis. Remember, the guy who paid for our Mithraeum learned about and learned how to worship Mithras in his office, in the customs department of the Roman Empire in this part of Europe. We have 2 other Mithraic sanctuaries that were populated and used by members of the customs office. Both of these have been excavated below the floors, and in neither case are there these kinds of deposits. That means that Vitalis, who founded the Mithraeum, brought one kind of technical knowledge. You worship Mithras by dedicating to Transitus. But he must have had someone else, some other ritual expert there who knew, well, you found a Mithraeum by commemorating a group meal and burying its remains under the floor. In other words, instead of looking at Mithraism as either one set of doctrine or beliefs or one set of common practices, we ought to understand it as a series of intersections of individuals, each with their own expertise, each with their own practices, and that these networks could recombine to create unique, new, and fluid forms of a cult that were recognizable while still being distinct and local. And that is how archaeology can help us to understand and reconstruct ancient religion. I would, of course, like to thank all of the sponsors who've contributed to this research. And I should also say that archaeology is very much a joint endeavor. I have worked with colleagues, archaeozoologists, paleobotanists, who have done a lot of the analysis that you've seen here tonight. We are a scientific community, and I'd like to thank all of you for becoming part of that scientific community in sharing these results tonight. Thank you. So I think we'll open the floor for questions. Yes?
Yeah. Are there any, you said the fragments are very limited. Is there anything in the early Hellenistic Greek philosophers or anything, Pythagorean, Neo-Pythagorean types?
So, one of the non-Christian sources we have for the cult of Mithras is a Neoplatonic philosopher named Porphyry, who's writing in the 3rd century CE. Porphyry writes this text called On the Cave of the Nymphs, and he uses it to explore the symbolic meanings of one line of Homer's Odyssey. And he brings up Mithras, and he says, the Persians worship Mithras in a cave, and that cave is a symbol of the universe. And it's like a Platonic universe that he reconstructs. And the whole point of him bringing up Mithraism is to show even the Persians came to the same conclusion as Plato, so it must be true. In other words, I think he's willfully distorting. Now there's one Mithraeum at the site of Ostia. Ostia sits just outside of Rome. And it's decorated with a whole range of astrological symbols, right? Signs of the zodiac, signs of the planet. And this has been read as being like proof that Mithraism is all about astrology. The problem is this particular Mithraeum is part of a house that belonged probably to the Neoplatonic philosopher Apuleius. So he is freighting the cult, taking that independent ability to create meaning around shared images and spinning it off in a Platonic, philosophical way. So I don't think we want to extrapolate from that one case. So I'm sure some people are doing philosophy as they do Mithraism, but I'm not sure that that's the norm. And in fact, the evidence for it is pretty restricted to sites like Ostia.
Is there any evidence that some of these were tried, or some of the texts or sculpture was damaged or tried to be destroyed like other religions have tried to, obliterate other...
Good. So the question is about the end of Mithraism. Was it destroyed by Christians? If we look at the archaeology of the few Mithraea that have been excavated well enough to say, what we can see is that there are very few of those telltale signs of Christian destruction. When Christians destroy things or smash sculpture, they tend to do things like carve little crosses in. There's none of that in Mithraea. Some do meet with violent ends. That is, they burn down. Buildings are built of timber and mud. They are dark. You light them with lamps. And the number one most common type of special ceramic found in Mithraea is an oil lamp. So the fact that they burn down doesn't necessarily mean violent Christian destruction. So the long and the short of it is, I don't think there is much evidence for that kind of violent Christian destruction. It seems more likely that these communities kind of petered out. They simply couldn't replenish members who were dying off. They weren't drawing in new members, especially in the 3rd and 4th centuries. So less violent end and more kind of withering.
In that early on, you showed a map of Mithraic monuments over
Yes.
Europe.
I noticed there was a huge concentration right on this border between England and Scotland. Is there any
Yes.
reason for that?
Yes. So, there are a couple of reasons for that. The first is historical. With archaeology, there are two explanations for everything. One explanation is it's historical reality. The other explanation is that's how the archaeological record was created. In this case, both of those apply. So the historical reality is that we have a lot of soldiers on that border between Britain and Scotland. And we know from inscriptions that they're the ones involved there in the cult of Mithras. So that's the historical reality. The archaeological reality, how the archaeological record is created, is that soldiers are the number one users of carved stone in the Roman Empire. They make things that are durable and that last for us to find. I showed you very briefly the Mithraeum at Tienen in Belgium. It was entirely built of wood. The only reason we know it's a Mithraeum is because scratched on a piece of pottery was a dedication to Mithras, and some of the ceramics have images of things related to the cult. But, 10 years ago, 20 years ago, never would have been recognized as a Mithraeum because it didn't have that stone monument. So in the case of Britain, we see that line along Hadrian's Wall because that's where most of the stone monuments in Britain are made. They're in London.
So you're detecting communal aspects, so that is the relationship, food, and lower class and soldiers. Is there any hint of medical connections? Because certainly along those lines, you'll see volitudinaria and other structures that were used for similar things, feeding, communal activity, and healing. Is there any hint that Mithraism has healing aspects to it?
So, and this is part of we need to see it not as one thing, but as lots of different things.
Matthew, could you repeat that question?
Oh, sorry. The question is there an association between the cult of Mithras and healing cult? The answer is yes, mostly in Gaul. So it's a very regionalized phenomenon. And part of, again, how the cult spins and draws on local backgrounds and local traditions, but not so much outside of Gaul. Now, I should also say that the kinds of communal activities, you get together, you have an eating and drinking party, these are things that in the Roman world you would do in other venues. You do them at some other temples, you would do them at funerals, you would do them to a lesser extent at home. The stuff I didn't get to show in the presentation. In looking at the ceramics from the site, most of the Roman ceramics were again messed up in the medieval period, kind of churned through. But there was on the eastern side of the sanctuary, outside the door, this very thick layer of little bits of ceramic and bone. It looks as though when people were done eating and drinking inside the Mithraeum, they just threw their garbage outside and smashed it up. Most of this ceramic is for eating and drinking. Now, in the Roman world, and in Apulum more broadly, most cooking is done in casserole dishes like the one you see down below. You bake whatever it is you're baking, as a casserole. In the Mithraeum, the most common cooking vessels are these jars. And we know they're cooking vessels because they have burning down at the bottom. These are like individual stew pots. So it's a very different way of cooking and consuming food than people in the town. They're also eating different things than people in the town. So from the Mithraeum more broadly, we have a lot of chicken. We think of chicken, again, as like the default meat. In the Roman world, it's the most expensive meat you can get. It is special occasion meat. We have pig, mostly young piglet, suckling pig, the tasty stuff. Some sheep goat, and very little cattle. And beef is what the soldiers are eating. Beef is what people in the civilian settlement are eating. So again, you come to the Mithraeum, you get a special menu. And you eat it in special ways. Cook it, prepare it in special ways. Yes?
We saw the shape of the frame and the benches.
Yeah.
How many people could gather in one of those?
That is a great question. So, in the case of our Mithraeum, sorry, we've got to go, there we go. We have, if we assume that people recline, or that people eat reclining, that's the norm in the Roman world, right? For special meals, you recline on your side. A diner takes up anywhere between 50 to 60 centimeters of space, which means that in this Mithraeum, along both benches, we can fit 25 to 30 people at a time. This is the norm for Mithraea. There are very few that are bigger than that. Some are a little bit smaller. So, when you think about, we've got 100 odd kilos of meat being consumed at that opening day festivity, they're not all going to be inside. So that's something that we have to take into account too. Yeah, that's a great question. I saw a hand in the back. Yes?
Do we know when the cult of Mithras first arose, say back in Persia or?
Okay, that's a great question. When did the cult of Mithras come into being? So, we know that Mithras is an old Persian god. He's kind of a second-order sun and, truth and faith god. Faith like good dealings, fair dealing god. But he's, as I say, a second-order god. Mithraea and that image of Mithras stabbing the bull only appear in the Roman Empire. There's not a single one in Persia. There's not a single one outside the Roman Empire. This tells us that the cult was probably invented in the empire itself. It just used an older god. It quarried old Persian religion for legitimacy. It's old, so it must be real, and it's exotic, so it has that added bonus of foreignness and foreign wisdom that you can then build something new around. And as further evidence of that, if we can go back to the end to the things that we didn't show, that whole image of Mithras stabbing the bull that we recognize is drawn directly from images of personified victory, stabbing a bull in sacrifice used in Roman imperial art. So this is a very Roman cult that pretends not to be Roman. Great question. Yes?
What is the thing that's going to curl your toes when you find it? What's the thing you'd love to find?
What is the thing I would love to find? That's a great question. Truthfully, it's going to sound a little boring. When I showed that map of where these boxes are across the empire, you'll notice that there are none of them in Italy. There are none of them around Rome. Despite the fact that we have the highest concentration of Mithraic temples there. The reason we have no dots in Italy on my map is because most of these Italian Mithraea have nice mosaic floors, not dirt floors, so no one goes underneath. I want to find one of these boxes by digging under the mosaic floors of the Mithraea at Ostia, or to guarantee that they're not there one way or another. So, doesn't sound all that glamorous. Yes, I'd love to find a painted statue of Mithras somewhere. No, I just want to look under some mosaic floors.
I'm a little puzzled by, you showed us on the map, I don't know how many of these Mithraeans that were present, but quite a number. But then you only showed us only one stone carved pedestal,
Yeah.
altar, with
Yeah.
lettering. There was only one. Now, in all the other sites, there were none.
So,
And yet, at that time, you're also showing us the carved reliefs. And we know that there are very capable carvers all around that region. So why is it that we only come across one dedicated altar piece
Good.
with lettering?
So, I only showed you the one from our site. I will say that 2/3 of these dots are simple inscriptions that say, sacred to unconquered Mithras. So-and-so dedicated this in fulfillment of a vow. So they're great for telling us who's worshiping Mithras, but they don't give us a lot of other information. So you're absolutely right. I simply didn't show them.
Okay.
But that is most of these dots. That's a really great point. Thank you. Yes.
How many dots
Oh.
is that?
Oh, I was hoping no one would ask me that. That's the question I fear most after. What is that particular dot? We're looking at about 120 odd sites, 120 to 150 odd sites across the Roman Empire. And again, most of them are just one inscription. Yes?
It appears that here you talk a bit more about the relationship between Mithras and the spread of Christianity. You must have studied that.
Good.
What can you share with us on that?
Yes. What is the relationship between Mithraism and Christianity? I brought that up in kind of a sleight of hand to catch you at the beginning. Franz Cumont argued very strongly that there was a relationship between these two religions, that they were similar in kind, that they were what he called Oriental cults, that were fundamentally different from most religions practiced in the Roman Empire. Now, what I've tried to show today is that, in fact, Mithraism is much more about practice, less about theology, less about creating complex thought content, and more about, well, making offerings to the god, eating and drinking as a community, things like that. So, for me, these actually diverge. Now, when Cumont made his argument that Christianity is just a cult like Mithraism, it was a very unpopular argument to make in Catholic Belgium at the end of the 19th century. He was actually drummed out of Belgium by the bishops and had to finish his career in Paris because this was such an unpopular argument. So what is the relationship? I think there's actually far less of one than most people assume.
Were there other mystery cults too at the time?
Yes.
ISIS and...
Yes. So, a number of cults that are mystery cults. That is, they had a mystery component. They had some kind of initiation and change in status associated with them, spread across the Roman Empire around this time. Isis and Serapis, Egyptian gods, are the other group. Maybe the god Jupiter Dolicanus, linked to Dolichae in Anatolia. What I would suggest is that many of these stem from similar dynamics of independent religious experts with some relation to one another, basically using these cults as a way of making some status for themselves, making some money for themselves, making a place for themselves in their various communities. So I think they stem from common sociological backgrounds. But each one does it in its own way. Yes?
Do you think that communal meals were quite common among all these different cults, and that would include Christianity? Do you think that that's a thread that runs through?
Yes. So creating a community is part of it. And again, going back to sort of sociological explanations, one of the things that defines the Roman world is its cities, an urban culture. And one of the things we know about the growth of urban culture today is that it promotes a kind of anonymity, a loss of community in some ways that has to be made up for. Look at things like, a sociologist wrote bowling alone, right? That idea that, in modernity we've lost community. And one of the things that happened under the Roman Empire is that these elective groups, these voluntary groups that you join in, these clubs, gain more and more prominence. And so communal meals are one way to create new societies that people can partake in. So the cult of Mithras is one. All of these other kinds of mystery cults, Christianity that has communal meals, are another. but the precise ways in which people dine differ. And again, right, we find very specific types of food selected in Mithraea. They really like chicken as a fancy bird. They really like to consume it in these individual stew pots. That's what differs, is how the meal happens. Yeah. Yes?
Is archaeology encouraged in Romania today, or is there resistance to it?
It is absolutely encouraged. And there are a number of projects that go on regularly. There are a lot of development projects, a lot of this rescue archaeology that happens as new buildings get built. So it's really a growing area, and our knowledge base is expanding rapidly. So yes, absolutely a great place for archaeology. And one of the things that we're doing is also training Romanian students to do this sort of scientific archaeology rather than sort of older Soviet-style archaeology where you dig a big pit down and then just read the stratigraphy off the sides. So, you know, we're actively sort of promoting and changing that as part of our project and its educational mission. So many hands. Yes?
Do you think this sort of the impetus for this type of religion is somewhat similar to when you think of things like the Freemasons, elves, lions, and so forth? There are associations, there is often ritual sort of activities involved. Obviously, this is more explicitly a religious sort of a thing.
Yeah.
But do you think it's sort of a common theme in human sociology?
Absolutely. The short answer is absolutely. That these threads run through time, through space, and through society. That these sorts of closely knit communal societies focused around shared experience, be it, you know, the shared experience of working in a customs office, or be it the shared experience of then coming together for a meal with your coworkers. These absolutely run through time. Yeah, absolutely.
We're looking at the Roman Empire, and Mithras was a Persian god. If the map went further east, would we likely find lots more red dots?
None whatsoever. As she asked, if the map went further to the east and showed the Persian Empire and Iran, would we see more dots? Would we see more evidence for Mithras cult? The answer is no, that this package of material, this type of sanctuary, this image of Mithras stabbing the bull, and this kind of material culture is strictly within the borders of the Roman Empire. However, one neat thing that happens is that at exactly the same time, 2nd century CE, in basically India, in the Mauryan Empire, Mitra gains popularity. He's worshipped in a totally different way, but it seems to be that, again, because he's a lesser-known second-order Persian god, people on the edges of the Persian Empire find him a convenient blank slate to build something of their own. But he looks different, he's worshipped in a different way. The only thing that's shared is the name. Yeah?
So how many Mithraeum were found, and was there a variation in size, or were they all like regulation?
Yeah, so that's a great question. She asked, how many Mithraea do we have, and how much do they vary in size? We have about 45 to 50, depending on, there's some that I'm not certain about, whether or not they're Mithraea. They might be. And most of them tend to be about 20 to 40 person size. There are a few that are absolutely enormous. There's one here in Spain at El Muntz at a villa just outside of the city of Taraco that's like giant. It can host probably 80 to 100 people. But that's the outlier.
I'm struck by the concentration of dots or sites to the northwest and the absence in Anatolia or Phoenicia or Egypt or Syria or whatever. What's your theory on that and the progression of the cult?
Good. So it is unevenly distributed. And it's easy to say, well, in Britain it has to do with the use of stone. Whereas in Anatolia, they've got lots of stone, everyone carves on it, everyone uses it. Why isn't there any Mithraeum there? The answer probably has to do with the vectors by which this cult moves, the social networks and communities. So there's a big concentration here in Central Europe along that customs route. There's a big concentration along some of the military centers up in the northwest. There's a big concentration around Rome. Those social networks, those groups, don't really extend into Anatolia or into much of what is modern Greece. At Dura, another site that I've worked at in Syria, it is very much the Roman army and the Roman soldiers that when they come to garrison the site, they already worship Mithras, they just build a new Mithraeum there. And they build it, we know it's built by soldiers, because they build it with the kinds of standardized bricks that only Roman soldiers make. Yes?
Following on with that, I'd always heard that the worship of Mithras was a Roman army thing. Is that an artifact of the fact that they worked stone,
yep,
and therefore their sites remain? Or is there enough evidence to say that it was perhaps a cult that drew people outside of the Roman military and officialdom?
Yeah.
The ordinary people.
So how military is the body of Mithras worshippers? This varies. The answer seems to be very much in Britain, but less so in Central Europe, where there's a large army presence, but the cult seems mostly to be imperial administrators, people like customs officials instead. So it varies by region, and we shouldn't overstate the importance of the army. In fact, Richard Gordon a few years ago went back and looked at our evidence for the earliest monuments to Mithras to see whether the military was the motor that drove the first expansion of the cult. What he found was actually most of the early adopters of the cult weren't military officials at all. They were in the minority. Most worshippers that we know about, both in the early phase and later on, aren't soldiers. And even in the case of army sites, the Mithraea tends to be in the civilian settlements rather than next to the fort. Yes?
You said that there are other mysteries or cults like the ISIS and things like that. Is there any more written record about those cults that then you could draw a parallel to Mithras?
Yes, we know a lot more about the cult of Isis. We have whole hymns that are preserved and that circulate around the Mediterranean to her. We have maybe a satirical question mark description of her cult written by the Latin rhetorician and philosopher Apuleius. So we do know more about her cult. But her cult's very different. So Mithraea tends to be out of the way, on the edges of towns, in sort of little plots of land that maybe the not-so-wealthy could afford, or built into private houses. Isis temples tend to be like in the middle of the city. They're big, they're bold, they're very public. It's a very different sort of relationship with context and community than the cult of Mithras. So I wouldn't want to use too much of that record for Isis to understand what's going on in the cult of Mithras.
Most of the practitioners probably men, and if there was an absence of women, would that perhaps be connected to the demise of this cult?
Yes. So the question is, are there women who worship Mithras? There is one Christian text that is very late and very problematic that says women worshipped Mithras. They were called hyenas, wild hyenas. I don't put much stock in that text. What I can say is that every inscription we have to Mithras is dedicated by a man. Now, that might not surprise us because most inscriptions, just statistically, are male-made or focus on male dedicants. So I'm not sure that absence of evidence is evidence of absence and that we can totally rule out women. At Tienen, up in Belgium, next to the Mithraeum, so not in the Mithraeum, but next to it, they found a couple of giant pits with rubbish that was thrown in after a big meal. This rubbish consisted of at least 140 sheep goats. Now that is a ton of meat. That's enough meat to feed like hundreds of people. So whether that's an all-male gathering or whether you've got to expand out just to, feed that many people, I don't know. I think there are probably levels of engagement with the cult, and I wouldn't rule out women entirely from at least some peripheral involvement. Yes?
You mentioned about the communal gathering taking place in July, August.
Yes.
Is there anything going on in the winter time? And as well as another question I have is, you said it started with the slaves.
Yes.
Is there anything like a founding slave who first started in Syria and then maybe the slaves got transferred to different places and then moved?
So in the case of our Mithraeum, and let me just fast forward again, Vitalis, our customs slave, we know that people who work in that customs zone tend to circulate among different customs stations. And it seems that Poetovio, in modern Slovenia, is like the headquarters of the customs system. So Vitalis probably started his career there, learned how to worship Mithras there, and then opened up his own Mithraeum, paid for his own Mithraeum at Apulum. We don't know who the founder of Mithraism was. Someone probably in Italy, probably in the late 1st century CE. As for, does anything happen in the winter? Well, this one foundation happened at the end of summer. For all of the other bones from the site, sheep and goat, sheep especially, they're born one time of year, right? There's one lambing a year. So if you can age the bones of a sheep, you can tell when it was slaughtered and what time of year it was slaughtered. And what we find is that we have every age of sheep possible. So things are happening at this building. People are coming together and eating sheep/goat. It's hard to tell the bones apart. They look very similar. People are eating sheep, goat year-round here. So things are happening in the winter, but it's founded in the late summer. Yes?
So the garbage that you find in these boxes, the remains, do you think that they're all from, I'm getting, at least I'm understanding that you would think that they're from one meal, from the first meal?
Yes.
And not from several meals, like over a period of, could be a year. And
Good.
Meeting a number of times and having a meal there and sharing, and whatever residue from those meals all goes in the same box.
Good. So one thing that we can tell from the soil and the material that was put in that box is that it all did go in one go. We did micromorphology. Right? We took a section of that soil, put it as a sort of slice under a microscope, and could tell that there weren't multiple events that were different that left material in there. So it was all one go. There was no stratigraphy that suggests different things happening at different times. It's all one event. But yeah, that's absolutely a great question.
And then it was sealed under the floor.
And then it was sealed under the floor, so you couldn't get back to it. Absolutely.
A question or two?
Yes?
Do you have any sense of what percentage of these structures, how many of them have been uncovered, and how many more do you think there might be?
Oh, how many more do I think there might be? So there are 45 to 50 that have been excavated. How many more do I think there might be? The sky's the limit. I have no idea. We know that at some sites, like Ostia, there are 15, 16 of them in a single city. At Poetovio, there are 4. At Aquincum, there are 4 or 5. So if a single city can have 4 or 5 of these, and you multiply that by the hundreds of cities across the Roman Empire, even just in the regions where Mithraism is common, and we might in antiquity have been in the order of the thousands. But that's wildly speculative.
Another question or two? I have to stand up for the Biotech Center. Any plans for molecular archaeology at the protein DNA level or anything like that?
Oh, I'm so glad you asked. The short answer is that we are partnered with a Arts and Humanities Research Council in the UK project that is looking at chicken genetics and human-chicken relations through history across Europe. And to understand the domestication of the chicken, how chickens are used, how they're bred, things like that. And so all of the chicken bones I showed you have gone off in a box to be part of that project. At some point, hopefully, we'll get some results back, but I don't have them yet. So absolutely, it's really exciting. I'd like to do more of that with our other animal bones, but we'll have to wait for other partner projects with more funding.
Thank you very much.